Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to today's discussion on critical histories of Indian literatures. We'll be joined today by Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan, Professor M. Asaduddin, Professor Rajendra Chenni, Professor Sachin Ketkar, and Professor T.S. Satyanath. Today's conversation will focus on the book A Critical History of Kannada Literature. To briefly introduce the book, this is the first volume to come out in a new series of critical histories of Bhasha literary traditions being brought out by Orient Black Swan, a series that is being edited by Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan and Professor M. Asaduddin. Authored by Professor Rajendra Chenni, A Critical History of Kannada Literature traces the development of Kannada literary traditions, from ancient texts to contemporary writing. The book examines how literary works respond to social, cultural, and historical contexts, and how Kannada evolved into a major literary language over time. It maps the key transitions that shaped the Kannada Renaissance, as well as modern and postmodern currents. It has chapters that explore drama and theatre, women's writing, literary criticism, folk literature and performance, and popular literature, highlighting the rich diversity of literary expression in Kannada. Let me now briefly introduce our speakers for today. Today's discussion will be chaired by Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan. He's a well-known critic in Malayalam and English, besides being an Indian English poet and translator. He's a former professor and dean, as well as Professor Emeritus of Central University of Gujarat. Professor Ramakrishnan has won several accolades, including the Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, the Odakudal Award, and the Vilasini Award. In 2023, he was awarded the Sahitya Academy Award for his Malayalam work, Malayala Novelinde Deshakalangal. Professor Asaduddin is an author, critic, and translator. He was formerly Professor of English and Dean at Jamia Millia Islamia. His translations have received the Sahitya Academy Award, the Katha and A.K. Ramanujan Awards for Translation, and the Crossword Book Award and the Urdu Academy Award, among others. Professor Rajendra Chenni, the author of A Critical History of Kannada Literature, is a distinguished bilingual critic, writer, and academic. He is a former professor of English at Kuvempu University and currently serves as the director of the Manasa Center for Cultural Studies at Shimoga. Professor Chenni has been the recipient of several honors, including the Karnataka Sahitya Academy Lifetime Achievement Award, the G.S. Shivarudrappa Award, and the Kannada Rajyotsava Award in 2025. Professor Sachin Ketkar is a bilingual writer, translator, and academic, currently teaching at MS University, Baroda. He has received several awards and accolades for his work, including the Indian Literature Poetry Translation Prize from the Sahitya Academy. His scholarship spans a wide range of areas, including comparative literature, post-colonial studies, and cultural history. Professor Ketkar is also the author of the upcoming book in the volume, in the series, A Critical History of Marathi Literature. Professor T.S. Satyanath is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literature Studies at the University of Delhi. His areas of interest include comparative Indian literature, translation studies, cultural studies, and folklore studies. He has written extensively on all these areas in both Kannada and English. Professor Satyanath's work on Indian literary traditions, and especially on Kannada literature, has made significant contributions to the field of Indian comparative studies. We thank the speakers for joining us today. I now invite Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan to chair the session. Just before that, for our Zoom audience, please use the Q&A box for any questions that you may have for the speakers. For those joining us on YouTube, please use the live chat box for your questions. Thank you. And over to you, Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan.
Thank you. Thank you, Sridhant. A warm welcome to all participants who joined from different parts of the country. And I'm sure your presence makes it a very unique event where we actually are discussing the relevance and also the importance, the significance of critical literary histories. As all of us are aware, the tradition of literary historiography carries a lot of colonial baggage. I wouldn't go into the history of this very complex, uh, what you call ideological struggle of imitation, resistance, rewriting, etc. But I would look at the moment somewhere in the late 20th century when a certain impetus towards decolonizing literary history was reached as a result of a confluence of several developments. And perhaps several models of literary historiography were already available at that point in time, and many of them are still relevant, and they have a certain function in our complex multilingual society. But we should actually mention one literary history which stands out, and that, of course, is Sisir Kumar Das's integrated history of Indian literature. He completed 3 volumes uh, during his lifetime. In fact, he attempted the impossible and succeeded in carrying it off, providing us a source book and a working model of collaborative history writing. We can always find limitations and certain kind of shortcomings in his very important the volumes, but they stand as a landmark when we discuss Indian literary historiography. Now, I mentioned the discipline reinvented itself under pressure from many kind of developments. Let me elaborate. The emergence of feminist and Dalit movements called into question this idealistic aesthetic rooted in universal notions of the literary that actually happens in the 90s or even earlier in some Indian languages like Marathi. Post-colonial and post-structuralist theories critiqued nationalist narratives, which were further problematized by subaltern historians, and now issues of race, caste, class, gender, region, religion, etc., could no more be dislodged from the notions of the text and the author and even the reader. So we had to come to the realization that literary historiography is a discipline that is mediated by several ideological locations, ranging from maybe issues of idea of caste, progress, region. There could be many fault lines. In fact, Professor Cheney's critical history of Kannada literature uses this word fault line in the very opening prologue when he discusses Kaviraja Marga. So while discussing Indian literary text or aesthetic text, we cannot totally ignore the kind of fault lines which lie behind them. And the question of literariness itself could not be separated from issues of orality and literacy, reading and reception, circulation and interpretation, reading public and literary public sphere. So many of these actually assumed greater significance after the post-colonial and Dalit and feminist critique of Indian literary text or Bhasha literary text. And here we also feel the multilinguality of Bhasha literatures had not really registered on many of these historians. And concepts like author, text, reader have different connotations in a multilingual society. And I am happy that Professor Cheney has again and again he has mentioned at a particular point in the chapter on Vajanagars, he does mention if there is a Sanskrit cosmopolis, there is also a Prakrit cosmopolis. And these are actually issues which require a whole lot of attention. I will request Professor Asaduddin to warn me of time. If I exceed, please ask me to stop. I should not actually go beyond maybe 2 minutes more.
Yeah.
See, so the exclusions which we actually find in a large number of literary histories are of different nature. One kind of exclusion comes from the idea of or the confluence of power and culture. The culture itself, in a way, constituting power, and that actually creates stereotypes, sometimes of a metaphysical kind or a spiritual kind, and poetry or certain genealogical kind of features are either denied or gifted to certain kind of texts. So canonization itself, consecration in the literary history itself is a way of, in a way, including or excluding. And for instance, in the Malayalam literary history, very often the role of missionaries could be seen as either being sidelined or the due attention is not paid. And there are also, I am reminded of a very important comment by Mahatma Gandhi while discussing his introduction to the K.M. Munshi's Gujarati literary history. He says this is the literary history as we actually, the language as understood and spoken by the middle class. And then he adds, of the language of the people, we know next to nothing. That criticism is still valid. How do we actually examine the idea of orality? How do we bridge the gap between the written and the oral? And there are questions of hybridization. For example, Arabic Malayalam or Jewish Malayalam, or there are similar kind of languages within what we call Indian languages. They are very often not properly understood, and they need to be brought into a history of Malayalam literature. So let me actually underline the fact that a whole lot of recent research has contributed to our idea of the past. For example, in Malayalam, a lot of research has gone into slavery. We know much more about slavery in Kerala than 50 years back or 30 years back. That does make a difference. Certain texts like Changanurati, etc., they actually have different connotation now. So historians of today have greater access to the research and insights from several disciplines. So it has emerged as an interdisciplinary site of mutual dialogue and mutual kind of, uh, you may say, critique. So we need to recognize that literary historiography can no more be purely a literary kind of phenomenon. It has to actually emerge into the space of interdisciplinarity, where several disciplines participate in the critiquing of notions, assumptions, categories, and even the idea of literatures. Let me stop here and request Professor Asaduddin to take over, and we will have each of us will have our take on some of these issues. I've been very general because this is the opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, EVR, for that background. I assume that many of our interlocutors today and participants, they are young researchers and students. And because literary historiography is not taught in colleges and universities, so perhaps a little more background will be helpful. Literary history as a genre, as I said, is not taught discreetly in colleges and universities. It's in India, it is of colonial origin. The literary histories that were written during the colonial period have the indelible stamp of colonial models. For example, Rambabu Saxena, who wrote the first history of Urdu literature in English, right in the beginning, he asserts that his model is that of George Saintsbury's A Short History of English Literature. So the models were taken from Europe or England, and the categories or subcategories were also taken from there. And while they were making pronouncement and judgments, they were heavily influenced by their understanding of what literature is in the light of their training of or the reading of the Western literature. After independence, Sahitya Academy was established in 1954, and one of the objectives of Sahitya Academy is to accumulate writings of the whole nation. And the catchwords were unity in diversity. And Indian literature is one, that famous statement, Indian literature is one, though written in many languages. Sahitya Academy sponsored history of literature in all the Indian languages. And obviously, the writers were given a certain brief. And the brief was to underline or highlight points of unity or uniformity rather than points of divergence. So in those histories of literature that were written from around 1960, the first volume was History of Bengali Literature in English, produced by Shukumar Sen, came out in 1960. And as far as I remember, a history of Urdu literature in English came out in 1993 by Ali Jawad Zaidi. If you take a look at those histories of literature, you will find that they are by and large descriptive accounts of writers and writings in English. There were hardly any reflections on the craft of history writing, literary history writing. It's with the work of Shishir Kumar Das, a history of English literature, or an integrated history of Indian literature, sorry, that came out in 1991, where you find detailed reflections on how to write or how not to write the history or the histories of Indian literatures. There, for the first time, you find detailed reflections on diachrony and synchrony, prophane and epiphane, concepts that were not generally understood, but discussed for the first time in his volume. To cut the long story short, throughout the 20th century or the latter half of the 20th century, you find that the endeavor was to put together writings in different languages in the histories of those literatures as though they grew independently of each other. There were silos. They were not seen as literatures growing together. Languages have their neighbors. For example, how can you even understand Assamese literature or Boro literature or Manipuri literature without making reference to Bengali literature? Perhaps your understanding of Oriya literature will remain inadequate unless you know the beginnings. And if you know the beginnings, you have to go to Bengali literature. In other words, in a multilingual country, no literature or history of literature can be written or understood in isolation. You have to, in some way, look at their interrelationships. Then there are movements that cut across languages. For example, I'll mention just one movement, a progressive writers movement. That the impact of that movement was evident in almost all the Indian languages, but the impact was not the same. In Urdu literature, you find it changed the complexion of writing. Hindi literature too, its impact in Bengali literature was also great. But as I was going through a Chinese volume of Kannada literature, I found that it didn't have any significant impact on Kannada literature. And I have also seen that in Telugu literature, the impulse of progressive movement was not necessary because the progressive movement was established in 1935. But in 34, they had a movement called Oibhudaya Rachayitala Sangam, Association of Writers for Upsurge. In other words, when you find these movements cutting across the languages, rather than studying them in isolation, confining them in one language, if you can see how they operated in different languages, our understanding of that particular literature and the neighboring literature, and by extension, Indian literature, gets deepened and enriched. And I'd like to highlight that these volumes, when they were conceived, we thought that there should be an endeavor to see all the Indian literatures in their interrelationships. Apart from the fact that the fault lines in the earlier volumes, the erasures in the earlier volumes that were published from 1960 onwards to the end of the 20th century, as far as possible, those fault lines also should be addressed. And I regard this particular volume as an important step in that direction. Thank you. You are on mute, Professor Ramakrishnan. If you are, we can't hear you. You are on mute.
I would like to invite Professor Chenny to give his
I'm of the opinion that if you want to take a definite perspective on writings in the Indian bhashas, and if you want to compose history, a literary history, you come across certain things which I think are shared by these bhashas. For example, the relationship and the negotiation between the local and the trans-local. I do not want to use the term like national, because if you're talking about the pre-national or the pre-modern period, you find a continuous negotiation of a very complex kind between the regional and what is the trans-regional. And the second is that literature during all these periods in our bhashas seems to have made some kind of a confrontation with the powers that control the cultural expression. For example, religion. When we read the poets of the so-called classical or the ancient Kannada poetry like Pampa, Janna, and others, we find that one of the negotiations had to be with religion, but it also meant that the religions which were of a trans-regional reach also brought linguistic issues, of course. Jainism in Karnataka, brought Apabharamsha and then Prakrit, and then later it also made use of Sanskrit. So the negotiation with one center of power like religion for the writers also meant that you would be, dealing with different linguistic domains. And you would try to look at the religious from another perspective. Then the larger historical forces, for example, starting with the monarchy and the feudalism, which is one of the important themes in ancient Kannada literature. I have commented in my book on how Pampa handles this in an extremely complex way. The idea of a royal patronage, the idea of a literary culture which existed at that time, in a way supported and patronized by monarchy, and how does literary expression, has to make sense of the presence of the literary culture of that kind. So I believe that this has happened in most of our bhashas. If there is, on the one hand, a very large kind of a historical dynamic force bringing about paradigmatic changes, the literature of the time has always responded to it. And as far as Kannada literature is concerned, my experience is that even from an ideological point of view, There are not many spaces where you can give a very simplistic explanation of either dependence or resistance. It goes beyond these binaries, and we need to locate these major texts in all our bhashas, I think, in such a framework where there are these existing historical forces, institutions, linguistic domains, and more importantly, there's a constant circulation also of the Shastric texts and the literary texts from one language to the other. The first extant Kannada work on poetics, Kaviraja Marga, for a long time it was read as only a translation of Bhama and Reddy. And only later readings were able to persuade us that there was something more than that happening. I'm sure this has happened with our other bhashas also. Then you have the impact of colonialism and colonial modernity. Once again, this can be described as one of the most important and powerful trans-regional forces which shaped Indian literature. If I go to the responses of Kannada fiction and Kannada poetry to colonial modernity, I find that the impact of what was happening in other languages motivated this writing. You have Bankim Chandra, you have Sharath Chandra, you also have other writers who, in a way, indirectly or directly, sometimes through translations, sometimes through recreations, they are creating modes of expression which become a part of the Kannada historical expression during the period of colonization. If you talk about the first Kannada social novel, Indrabai, then you have this very clearly there, the very narrative structure and the decision to include certain thematic aspects and certain perspectives on what colonialism is doing to your very local society. These, I think, are issues that one has to deal with. And then one of the last things is which you and Professor Asaduddin have already mentioned, the continuous entry of very vast social worlds which were excluded from literary expression. See, on the one hand, you have almost a parallel cultural literary expression in the oral traditions. We have not yet done justice to. It's not just so much of a ethnic or different writing. I would say it is a major expression of culture and society. And this brings to us, I mean, whatever is available, whatever has been researched, whatever has been theorized in relation to Canada, it's like confronting a very different kind of a social world. And the deeper you go into it, you see that what we have continuously believed to have been very stable, very hegemonic, and very powerful were continuously questioned in these, interrogated, questioned, and rebelled against in the domain that we have. And then you have the Dalit writings, and you have the writings from those who I do not want to use that very ugly word, uh, minority. We are talking about very authentic social worlds, see, which are so interesting and so complex, so much a part of both the local and the trans region. I think that is the material which literary histories of the bhashas have to deal the heterogeneity the enormous variety and the quantum of literary and cultural expression, and a continuous kind of a relationship of many kinds, being appropriated, being rebellious, transforming the existing structures, which continuously happens in literature. I think these are some of the experiences that I had when I began to think of writing literary history, critical history of Kannada literature.
Thank you, Professor Chenny. Very, very relevant and insightful. And we will listen to Professor Sachin. Sachin, can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah, so good evening. It's an honor to be part of such an important panel. And some of the observations made by Professor Asaduddin, Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan, Professor Chenny have actually resonated with my own work in many ways. For example, when Professor Ramakrishnan pointed out that it's the post-colonial turn where the processes of decolonization have started, I think, becoming more and more prominent after 60s. There was a turn towards literary historiography. Seemed to be very important observation in my own project. But interestingly, when I look at it, the earliest histories of Marathi literature written in English seem to address a very interesting situation. For example, the two of the earliest histories of Marathi literature in English appeared in, I think, 1917 and then later 1920s or so, by two scholars. One is Nadkarni and the second was Bhate, Gochi Bhate, also called Traveler Bhate. And the reasons that they gave for writing such a history was that Marathi literature was introduced as a subject in Bombay University. And Bhate and probably Nadkarni point out that many of the students of Marathi literature, Marathi students, can't read Marathi literature in original. And this is 1920s and 30s. And so this kind of work will help them to appear for the examinations of Bombay University. So it makes me curious whether the histories that we are bringing out in English will also serve similar kind of objective, that there would be many Marathi speakers who would like to revisit or connect to their literary past, would go back to a book in English rather than abundant books that are available in Marathi. Or somebody from Kannada speaker would like to reconnect or revisit with their Kannada roots, would actually approach a book like Professor Chenny. So that is something that is an interesting angle that I always keep in mind and in my own project. So I would like to highlight just one important point here, apart from what Professor Ramakrishnan and Professor Asaduddin says, is certain crisis in English studies. In fact, it has something to do with certain kind of turns that English studies discipline in India seem to have undergone after the 60s, that we are approaching this kind of project. And why is English studies or subject of English important here is something that we have to keep in mind. And given the fact that English in India has a very problematic place, politically loaded and contradictory, it's always very interesting to ask ourselves why such kind of projects, which are deeply interdisciplinary, which are deeply informed by theoretical and critical formulations seem to happen in English. Because when I look at Marathi and Gujarati literary histories, I don't see much of interdisciplinary work happening. Means, of course, there are a certain kind of chronological accounts, but there is very little interdisciplinarity in terms of the sociological or cultural or political historiography. There is hardly a serious engagement with these kind of questions or theoretical questions of what is literature, maybe in Marathi, whether that is a universal definition or whether definition of what we mean by literature in Marathi is different from the one that you may find in Kannada or in Gujarati. Such kind of questions are not raised in most of the Marathi literary historiographies that I have seen. Means they are very informative, they are very loaded with information about authors, their backgrounds, their books, their chronologies, and even hagiographical information and all that. But they seem to not engage with the questions like what is modernity and what is post-colonial history has to do with the question of literary historiography itself. So these are major gaps in Marathi and Gujarati literary histories. And our project seems to be addressing those gaps, but in English. So that I feel that maybe these books like mine will have to go into our own languages like Marathi or Kannada and that they will make some certain important contribution there as well is what I thought of. Again, as Professor Ramakrishnan says, that the Orientalist historiography and Indian reaction to it seems to be one of the backgrounds and one of the core influences on the projects of writing literary historiography. And I find that this reaction to Orientalist discourse can itself become a limiting factor. For example, one slips into either certain kind of nationalist discourse, as you find in Marathi, or later on certain forms of very parochial nativist formulations, which are not really interested in looking at, say, for example, even what has Tukaram to do with Persian culture, for example. They are not even willing to consider such kind of inquiry. And that kind of hardcore nativism that Tukaram stands for, pure Marathi authentic identity, can be limiting. And my own project tries to go beyond these kind of nationalistic or even nativist formulations. So these are some of the concerns that I carried, and these are part of my own project. And when I see Professor Chenni's work, I'm very happy that now I can find a very interesting comparison with Marathi, because Kannada and Marathi have a deep linkage, which needs a lot of exploration. Means a lot of Marathi literature is deeply influenced by Veershaiva literature, as well as the region adjacent to Kalyan, the areas near which became a hotbed for movements like Mahanubhava Pantha. So what is relation between Mahanubhava Pantha and Veershaiva? All these things are, I think, because of Professor Chenni's volume, now I have material on my hand to look at it comparatively. So maybe now comparative literature in India has really come of age, and we can safely go beyond the East-West model and maybe start thinking about Marathi and Kannada comparative literature happening in English studies department. So I think these are important developments brought about by this project. So these are some of my views about it. And I would like to congratulate Professor Chenni for such an excellent volume that he has brought out.
Thank you, Sachin. Since you are actually in the process of writing your volume, I'm sure Chinese volume speaks to you with greater,
Yeah.
you see.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of your last observation, I think, is very important. Comparative literature in a very Indian sense now could actually
Yeah.
could be addressed with all these volumes. If in the coming few years, if you have few more volumes, I think will be in a stronger
Yeah.
situation to debate these interlinkages between languages and literatures. Thank you. Uh, Professor Satyanath, your
Okay.
take on the topic and
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. It's a matter of pleasure. History of literature or literary history is actually a nationalist project when it started. But by 1979, it had lost its steam, and René declares the end of literary history. In the next 30, 40 years, it's also the period of a lot of revival. For example, it's the period when the linguistic turn took place, the cultural turn, a spatial turn in the early 90s, an intermediate turn in the mid 1990s, and a digital turn. Particularly the digital turn radically altered the nature of the archive that's available for literary historians and in students of literature. In this context, 1990s marks a very significant uh, stage in the literary history. And I would like to mention just two important works that came during this period. The first one is The Literary Cultures of Latin America. This is Mario J. Waldes and Linda Hitchens' 3-volume published during 1995 and 2000. In a very important document, Rethinking Literary History Comparatively, both the authors actually do rethinking and redefine it. It is to stop, take a look back, and critically analyze literature, which would lead probably to a paradigm shift in the way of understanding literature. So the turns and the rethinking is the characteristic of 1990. What these 3 volumes do is, to put it in a single line, it brings it interdisciplinarity, which we are talking here, into the literary history. So literature is confronted, or is linked to social sciences, geography, demography, political economy, linguistics, and anthropology. But literary history doesn't become these things. The authors are very clear. Each of these highly developed disciplines cannot simply be ransacked for ideas. That's what they underscore. And the ultimate result they claim is multiplicity and interactiveness in literature and other disciplines. It's a dialectic, a discursive. So, and these volumes are also very radically different in their nature. It has 205 articles. Only 33% of them were written in English. The rest of them were written in Portuguese and Spanish and were subsequently translated into English as a final stage. Continuing this spirit, 4 more volumes of History of Literatures of East Central Europe, Junctures and Disjunctures. They appeared, and the last 2 volumes have a subheading I'm not going to. This is actually by Maurice Cornish Pope and James Newar, 2005-2017. Here, they don't look at literature as a product of a geographical area. That means the watershed contour concept of literary area is not considered. They look at it as a network of relations, and they more as a constellation. So they propose notes to study this. This is, let me go ahead. hybridity, boundaries, marginocentricity, multicultural corridors, cultural interfaces, and imaginary communities. This it's a marginalized area and a multilingual area, an area where migration, where self-exiled, ness, and a lot of other factors. The consequence of that was very brilliantly executed articles. Let me now go back to Cheney's work to see what, I mean, I don't expect anyone to read. I taught Indian literary historiography after Shishir Das retired from the department. So, I'm continuing that. What this work, Kannada work, how does it is relevant to us or relevant to the most important achievements of literary history in the last 20, 25 years each because of this. First of all, it brings in intermediality into its discussion. This, in the prologue, he locates Kannada literary culture into transcript tradition, Gamakavachana tradition, and the Yakshagana tradition. The volume itself has a picture of Yakshagana. What it does is, it brings in what I call otherwise scriptocentric, phonocentric, and body-centric modes of representational schema of Indian literature into the discussion, which is happening for the first time. We haven't seen it. It actually, in this process, it also creates three different publics: the courtly public, the temple matha public, and the performative public sphere, which has different sensibilities. So they are overlapping to some extent, but the sensibilities are different. So importantly, while it brings in intermediality, it also brings in multiple sensibilities into the orbit of history of literature or literary history. Thirdly, it brings in genres which are not normally addressed in literary histories. I must mention that, when V. Sitaramaya brought out his 34 volumes, he had 2 volumes, one on folklore and one on Yakshagana. They appear again here as 2 important chapters. So there is folklore and popular literature, which constitute 2 different volumes. Then lots of social epistemologies, which are not part and parcel of literary history that although we see its traces in Shishir Das' work. So what it does is, it brings in caste, religion, gender, and a variety of issues which are social epistemology into the understanding of literary cultures. Thereby, the most significant thing that we notice is, instead of a script-centered reading, we have sonosphere and visual spheres in the domain of literary history, which probably we have not done it. Let's go back to the early 1990s. The spatial turn, the intermediate turn, and the digital turn. It doesn't take digital turn, but anyhow, that doesn't matter. So, having achieved these things, I think this volume, according to me, becomes an important model. In fact, it is a benchmark for this, not only the other volumes of this series, but also probably for the literary history or history of literary culture that we are going to talk in the days to come. I think I'll stop here. If there is another round, I would like to take up another issue and talk about that.
Thank you, Satyanath. You made very important points regarding the achievements of this particular volume, and they are very well taken. I would like to know from Srinath whether we should open it for the audience, because you wanted around 7:20. What do you suggest, Srinath?
If we are going for one more round focused on critical history of Kannada literature, the volume, we can do that, but very briefly. maybe,
Very briefly, maybe 2
very
minutes, 1 or
briefly.
2 minutes at the most.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And then
Yeah.
we can take up questions. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So very briefly, I have a lot to say on this very erudite literary history, but I found insightful there are a whole lot of the critical apparatus has been brought on the analytical part of almost every text. Kaviraja Marga has been one text I have been trying to understand for a long time. And in the prologue, he actually looks at it very holistically, how a text which was ignored, as he mentioned just now, by the reading public or even the scholars, suddenly has become a very important text for understanding the idea of Kannada identity. And Sheldon Pollock has called this as the very first book of aesthetics in a vernacular language anywhere in the world. So its significance can be. So, and I find many insights in his analysis. For example, when he mentions Kaviraja Marga talks about the large number of dialects which Kannada has, and he quotes one line I would like to quote here. It includes an interesting discussion of the many regional dialects of Kannada, which are so many that they outnumber the many tongues of the mythical Adishesha. And it's after all this discussion that a particular dialect is identified as fit for writing poetry. So when this happens in the year 850, it actually was a major critical kind of intervention in the production of what is literary. And he discusses at length the question, does Kaviraja Marga enunciate a distinctively Kannada aesthetics? That's a question he answers very substantially with a lot of insights. I don't want to go into, I found the chapter on Vajanakaras, particularly the question of the kind of aesthetics Vajana has always been understood as a part of Bhakti tradition. But Professor Cheney's discussion makes it very clear there are differences between poets. There are many strains within the Vajana tradition. And Allama may not agree with Basava on some of the issues. So, and this question, how a very radical movement originated in a society at a particular point, flourished, and then disappeared with no trace, that also leaves a whole lot of, there is a kind of mystical, mysterious aura about it. I found his comment on the Natha tradition, and that's where I think pan-Indian elements are brought into his discussion wherever he can actually do it. That in a way widens the ambit of the critical debates which he actually takes up in each of the issues. And what Professor Asaduddin mentioned is I also found Navodaya is largely a romantic, there is not much discussion on the progressive movement, though I have always felt Karant is more of a progressive writer than a is a modernist writer. So there are differences between Malayalam and Kannada and other languages. And he also discusses all the major Kannada modernists with a lot of insight, with a lot of critical the explication. And the movement when modernism transforms itself into a new kind of avant-garde writing where Dalit and feminist elements enter it, that is captured in the same chapter with that's where Devanur Mahadeva, Siddhalingaya, and all these writers, even before their arrival, you find Purnachandra Tejasvi and some of the writers gradually distancing themselves from the high modernist kind of a mode. So these are all nuanced ways of bringing out the undercurrents in a very large society where multiple centers of power actually are in conflict, and the text actually reveal this element of what you call conflict and contradiction. So I will stop here. There is much here for students who are researchers and critics who are practicing like me. There is much here that will open up a whole lot of ideas. Professor Asad, did I take more time? Sorry. Asad can add.
I'll just in 1 minute, I'd like to
Yeah.
highlight two things that I found significant, both in the volume and in the presentation made by Professor Cheney. One, the importance of translation, because we find that the whole colonial modernity in almost all the Indian languages was negotiated through translation of works that were received in India from outside. And in traditional histories of these literatures, you will find hardly any discussion on those translations. Come to think of it, many of our writers in the beginning, some of the writers at least, they began as translators, and then they gained enough confidence to write creatively in those languages. So there is inadequate discussion in those volumes on translation itself. And then what are the models when our translators translated? If they accepted the model of naturalization, then was there any agenda behind it? This kind of discussion is lacking in all those volumes. The second thing he says that in those histories, perhaps you find vast areas of social experiences were left out because they were not considered perhaps mainstream. So you find this dichotomy in all these volumes between what you consider mainstream and what you consider marginal. And there may be unlit corners, linguistic corners that were left unaddressed or unattended. I'll give you one example. That there's a significant number of Bangla-speaking population in Assam who produce their own kind of Bangla literature. But in the traditional histories of Bangla literature, you will find hardly any mention of that. So apart from the literature that is produced by people who are located perhaps in obscure corners, far-flung areas, were brought in this volume. By reading Cheney's volume, I had the feeling that his focus was equally there on both on the mainstream and the marginal. And I think that's a significant point.
Thank you, Asad, and that actually point is well taken. We would like to get the comments from Professor Cheney.
Well, I was reflecting on the comments made by the fellow panelists here. I believe that in every important juncture, what we now describe as a conjuncture, there is need to rewrite literary histories. The texts remain the same. There are continuities, of course. It's not that texts disappear, but because of this, conjunction of so many other things, we always feel this need to rewrite. And one of the reasons to rewrite a literary history is to make it relevant to our own preoccupations and concerns. I think that was one of the things because I look at my book as, in a way, a comprehensive statement which shares the readings which have come out of these texts in Kannada literary culture. Uh, it's not that one individual author can reread all these texts. What has been happening is in the Kannada literary establishment or in the Kannada literary culture, texts are always subjected to new readings, and that leads to a different formulation of literary history. And the concern always is you are looking for other things through the lens of this literature. It should happen. I don't consider it as negative at all. So what I had with me was this enormous corpus of readings, see, which began with the Navodaya tradition, rereading the ancient texts, rereading the contemporaries. This is continuously happening. And I thought that all these readings should find a place. And I mentioned in my book that unfortunately there's a slight disjuncture from the critical reading and literary history. This has to be bridged, in a sense, because literary history would not be just a mention of texts and names. It should also include the way a contemporary reader is looking at those texts. I think that is probably the purpose, which was somewhere in my mind. That's the comment I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Sachin?
Yeah. What I found very interesting, I have not been able to read this book, but I've started reading it. And one of the things that struck me was the way it is structured. And given my own structure of literary historiography, my own model follows certain chronology. And I have used periodizations, which are more or less conventional, but then again, I have altered them a bit. So one of my interventions was also intervention in periodization issue. So I have retained certain chronological uh, narrative, if you want to put it that way, and included almost all the kinds of discussions that Professor Chennai has done separately, like women's writing or drama or theater or folk, which I subsumed under those chronological periods, and also included the modern debates over the some of the authors belonging to that period. For example, if it is Tukaram, then how I have tried to locate Tukaram in the chronological and historical background, but also looked at modern debates around Tukaram, important one. So I have followed more or less a chronological structure. And one of the things that I had in mind was also utility to students who are appearing for various kinds of exams in Marathi, MPSC, or what have you, where these kind of chronologies would matter. So I found Professor Chennai's kind of structuring of this book very fascinating. Means and how literary historiography can be approached in a very different way is probably what his book reveals. And as Professor Asaduddin pointed out, the question of translations have often been neglected, and almost all Marathi literary historiographies don't give attention to translation when they are looking at even pre-colonial periods where translation-like activity happened. And only very recently have I discovered that there was a kind of translation activity which resembles post-colonial translation activity, where you have a source text and target text, and especially that of a Veershaiva text, which was translated into Marathi in the 17th or 18th century, which resembles translation that we find after colonial period. So importance of translation is, I think, something that this book has emphasized, which is very important. And that is something which, again, is very important to my own project as well. So that's my take on this book at present, because not been able to read it. Only recently I've started looking at it. Yes.
Thank you, Sachin. And Professor Satyanath?
Yeah, thank you. I think I will take up an issue, particularly bhakti. The chapter that Chenny, title of the chapter that Chenny chooses is Vachanakaras. Out of the entire 11 or 12, this is the only chapter which addresses the name, the poets rather than the literature. I mean, I try to understand it's a bit problematic. In the next 2-3 minutes, I'll try to problematize not the titling, but the bhakti, our understanding of bhakti. I also taught bhakti for about 15 years, so that I'm little familiar with the bhakti poems of other languages. Bhakti is understood in two diametrically opposite from two diametrically opposite positions: philosophical, cosmopolitan, Sanskrit, and related things. For example, Jaideva and his erotic poetry, and then from the literary, social, vernacular point of view. The two positions have not tried to negotiate. Consequently, what happens to it, if you want an eroticism of a similar type of Jaideva, the Gujarati poet, Sachin himself has translated a couple of his extraordinarily erotic poems. See, here the vernacular is opposing. Vernacular is understood as opposing something. That means, and at the same time, in some writings, it's vernacular superiority over the cosmopolitan bhakti. So this actually tries to put the two things, or understanding bhakti in a multilingual context, because bhakti poems never confined to their region. The singers carried them across the linguistic barriers. That means you find Kabir being sung in Deccan, you find the Gujarati songs being sung in Maharashtra, and vice versa, and a variety of other things. Meera sung all over. So how do we understand this? And how do we see this would be problematized by two writings of Elaine Fisher. See continuities in the scriptural corpus of the Veera Maheshwaras. So early Veerashaivas were called as Veera Maheshwaras. This is particularly in the Sri Shailam area and a matha called the Goliki Matha. And translating Veerashaivism, the early modern monastery as transregional network. I will try to bring in something. What she does is, she takes up this Goliki Matha, which came into existence in the early part of 13th century, from 1313 or so. There are inscriptional evidence. It represents two important, Panditaradhya and Palkurki Somanatha. Pandita, within the Veerashaiva discourse, there is a tension between the Gurusthalins and the Viraktas. Both Prithvi and Herat, they try to locate the Viraktas around the 15th century, and the other one at the 13th century. What happens because of this is, if you consider the writing in Telugu Sanskrit, Kannada, Tamil, Marathi, then this puts us in an entirely different network. The network is temporal on the one hand, because the writings of Panditaradhya and Palkurki Somanatha could be linked to 7th century Lakulisha Kalamukha sectarian writings that is available to us. So that's an entirely different thing. And spatially, because it connects it with Somanath, that means Saurashtra, it connects it with Sholapura and Siddharama, and to Balahonur, and further down to Kanchi and Kumbakonam. So there is what she argues is essentially there is a network. And within this network, we still don't have a very clear area. Some discussions were taking place in Sanskrit, but how does literary text played a very important role? I would just like to bring in Basava Puranamu in Telugu, which is the first seminal text.
We don't, Satyanath, can we?
1 minute.
Can you? 1 minute.
1 minute.
Okay.
1 minute.
Yeah.
This is the conclusion.
Yeah.
For example, the Shekila's Periya Puranam, when it and Basava Puranam in Telugu, Basava Puranam in Telugu is closer. You have Harihara's Ragales and Kannada's own Bhima Kavi's Basava Puranam. You have Shivalilamrit. And towards 16th, 17th century, this text, again, material from this text just goes back into Sanskrit. So, these are very interesting flows. So, see, so the question is, how do we understand this? What is the relationship between Therigata and the women saint poets? They are equally rebellious. What is the relationship between Charyapadas and the Bedagina Vachanas of Allama, which is written in a riddle format, and many of the writings in Mahanubhavas? So, there are continuities. What I'm trying to suggest is, there are continuities, and probably Bhakti, I can also go and, bring it to 1970s, where the Kannada revivalism takes place, particularly the theater and the film, and this has a all India footprint. So I think, it is possible with this particular literary history, this mode of literary history, that the next phase could be a comparative literary history of Indian literature, which Shishirdas aimed and started, but it didn't go beyond 2 volumes. The 3rd volume was collated and just published, the early version of that. So I think this particular volume and this particular series provides us a platform for the next phase of literary history, which is a much more comprehensive comparative literary history of literary cultures of India. I mean, with this optimism, I thank EVR and the Orient Black Swan for getting me here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satyanath. Srinath, whatever time is left can be opened up for our audience.
Because we have a few questions, but we are completely out of time, so we'll take only a couple of them and try to answer very quickly. The first question is to Professor Ketkar. To Professor Ketkar's comment on literary historiography in Bhasha literatures, could we locate the limitations of literary historiography in Bhasha literatures not in scholarly inadequacy, but in systematic disparities in funding and institutional support?
I'm not so sure about that, given my own experience, because I find that there is certain reluctance among the scholars of Marathi and Gujarati to engage with English interdisciplinary texts. And that I see as a very recent phenomenon, because in the times of scholars like Suresh Joshi, who were phenomenal bilingual scholars, but they wrote primarily in Gujarati. However, that tradition seems to have disappeared, and the kind of bilingual scholarship that is expected for a complex interdisciplinary projects like this seems to be on decline, which seems to be, for me, a more important reason than lack of funds or institutional support. Because I worked on this project with no funding and no institutional support, for example. nor would Professor Chenny would be. So it's not the question of institutional support or funding, but I think the whole desire to engage extensively with both the languages and the scholarship in both the languages is something that is lacking in both Marathi and Gujarati. There's some sort of reluctance to read English theory or even maybe more recent historical writings or in religious studies or sociological writings and so on. So that is what I find in Marathi. Where in Marathi you find feeble attempts happening, but not as much as it seems to happen in the English studies in India today. So I don't think that's the reason, though other scholars can also, I think, opine on this.
I agree with you, Sachin. There is a decline in what you call meaningful, productive kind of bilingualism. Ramachandra Guha once actually mentioned there is an
Yeah.
acute shortage of public intellectuals who are, you see, bilingual. And that also, in a way, you see, reflects a certain paucity of, you see, what you call this kind of debates, interdisciplinary debates. So
And
some
also, like
languages.
in Marathi, you have nativism of a very parochial kind, which says that why should we read anything in English for
Yes.
studying Marathi literature? So that kind of parochialism has done a lot of damage to Marathi literature as well.
Very true. Very true.
We take up one more question.
Yes.
This is in the context of the speakers mentioning the Sahitya Academy project of bringing out literary histories. Many of them, and definitely R.S. Mugali's History of Kannada Literature, were translations of histories originally written in regional languages. Did this define the nature and scope?
Is it addressed to anybody in particular?
No, anyone in the panel can, yeah.
Yeah. Asad, would you like to answer?
Because I think it is specific to the Kannada language. Question is so.
I mean, I would like to just comment on that.
Yeah.
I think the Sahitya Academy project, it was itself was not conceived to our satisfaction today. You know, at that time, you know, for example, even the bibliography volumes, they were conceived by Keshavan and others. They had their own limitations. So we should locate these volumes in the 1960s. And with the theme, I said Indian literature, you know, it has already been mentioned, you know, now that the nation project of nation is over, you know, the whole purpose is to establish that. So they were intended to put a point forward that Indian literature is written in multiple languages. Secondly, the Mughal is definitely an excellent scholar, but he had written this volume already for a different set of audience. That means he was writing it for the students of Kannada literature. Student means I'm not talking of student, you know, the school student or scholar. And it was located in a regional milieu. This was translated with some modifications to suit the Sahitya Academy requirement. And they were all page, you know, for example, you will see the limitation. Nayak's History of English Literature is also 200 pages, and Kannada, Tamil literature is also 200 pages, which properly Mudaliar wrote it. And the Kannada one is also equally. So there were several disparities associated with the very project and its model. And they were also thinking of major poets and minor poets. You know, who is a major? How can we decide a major? So I think this has all limitations of an age, where the history of literature was actually located with an entirely different set of norms. That is the reason probably why Ramshi Mugli's volume is weak.
And I think the unity in diversity kind of an ideological approach also imposed certain limits to this actually is reflected in the P.K. Parameswaran Nayar's literary history of Malayalam, where this actually decides the approach to the text. And yes, Srinath, any more questions?
There are many other questions, but we are, unfortunately, completely out of time. So
Yes.
we need
One
to.
more question we can take if time permits.
We can, if we can quickly answer that. There is one question that has come on Zoom about lesser known Bhasha Sahityas, for example, the Haryanvi, and the possibility of bringing such literature into the mainstream. If you would like to quickly kind of address that question.
Yeah, that you see, there are languages like Santali or many of the minor languages in India have not actually had the written, you see, tradition for a very long time. Some of them had, you see, and that's one of the problems we were discussing. You see, the oral traditions very often are not documented. So when you attempt the history of a particular language and literature, not many written texts are available, and a whole lot of things are actually uh, and a language like Haryanvi now has state patronage and maybe an institutional backing. Maybe it has, it's in a better position in the coming years, maybe to produce a literary history with, and the digital kind of the resources may also help to access oral the literatures of the past. So maybe we will have to actually wait for the more such attempts to bring in such languages into the area of literary histories.
I mean, just this is actually the problem of creating a literary archive. How can we create a literary archive for Haryanvi? No, when one of my students worked on history of Manipuri and Dogri literature in a comparative perspective, we couldn't put beyond 150 books to do a survey of literature, book, and we wanted to extend it to Konkani. We couldn't get a bibliography to do that. So, the question is, can we generate an archive, and what is the nature of material that we can put into this archive? That decides the inclusion of other Indian languages, the possibility of inclusion of other languages.
So thank you. Thank you all panelists, all my dear friends, close friends. So no formal thanks are due. But it was a very enjoyable kind of discussion, and I'm sure congratulations to Professor Chenny. Rajendra Chenny actually deserves praise and congratulations for producing
Yes,
an
a
excellent
huge
volume.
round of applause for him.
Yes. We actually find this will definitely, the series has taken off with a bang. That thanks to Professor Chenny.
Just a word before we disperse. I expect that some of the authors of the volumes that are going to come out in the next couple of months, they are part of the audience. So I would very humbly request them to speed up the work so that we can bring out these volumes in quick succession when the momentum is there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Sincere
Thank
thanks
you.
to all the panelists for a very interesting and engaging discussion. And thanks also to Comparative Literature Association of India for helping us organize this event. And there was a question about whether a recording of this would be available. Yes, very soon a recording of this will be available on the OPS YouTube channel. Please do watch that, check that out. And thank you everyone for joining the discussion on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Hope you have enjoyed this session. Thank you so much. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Thank you.